Hey everybody, thanks for coming today. My name is Michael McFaul. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. This is a great day for me, a great day for FSI, a great day for CDDRL, and a great day for anybody that cares about the advancement about knowledge in the world today. We are here to launch, although I think you already launched somewhere else, Frank, but we're part of the launching party for Frank Fukuyama's new book. It's called Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. Frank, for those of you who don't know, there's very few people on the planet that don't know who Fukuyama is, so it's kind of silly to ever introduce him. It's one of those names I can say in any country. And I say, do you know Fukuyama? And everybody knows my colleague at Stanford. There's a lot of colleagues they don't know, no offense to the rest of us here. But just a couple formal things I want to remind you that he is. He is the senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, the Olivier Nomalini Senior Fellow. He is also the Mosbacher Director for FSI's Center on Democracy Development and Rule of Law, which he currently runs now. It was a fantastic coup that Stanford recruited him from that other coast. For me personally, I don't even care where he worked over there, but he came here. And just on a personal basis, I just want to say a couple of things. I've known Frank and known his work for a long time. I've taught lots of his work over the decades. What I didn't expect when we first hired Frank, and I hired Frank Fukuyama, by the way. So other people take credit for that. I was the one. No, okay. It's all, we did it all as a team. But I got to tell you honestly, Frank, you know, you'd written lots of very important books before you came here, some of them historic, and we're going to talk about that. And I kind of thought, you know, you're going to come out here, it's nice, it's beautiful, you've done all this work already, everybody knows your name around the world, and I thought, you know, you're just going to coast, but having Fukuyama coasting I thought was really going to be a great thing for Stanford. Little did I know that he would continue to produce, including 2 volumes, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but also this volume. And I actually don't know of a single social scientist on the planet that has been more productive over the entire spectrum of their career, not just the first couple of decades. And I just deeply admire that. Moreover, Frank doesn't ask little questions. He asks really, really big questions. As we're going to talk about today, the last 2 volumes, in his last 2 volumes, I think he covered all of human history. Actually, it's before human history. That volume started and ended, you know, in our current era. And he doesn't just ask big questions that he brings data to answer synthetically, which I think we just need more of. Frank's also not afraid of answering and tackling really hard, consequential questions. Identity is one of those, especially on a university campus. Identity, to take data and to think big and to think provocatively, that is a very challenging thing to do, a very brave thing to do. And I just want to applaud that effort and to encourage the young people, actually encourage the old people too, in this hall today to think along those ideas, ask the big questions, don't be afraid to tackle the controversial issues, but when you do so, bring data to your hypothesis testing as Frank does, and I'm just in awe of that. Last thing I want to say about Frank, he's just a fantastic colleague. He's willing to talk about many things because he knows many things. He's willing to change his mind based on data. In many ways, I think he is exactly the kind of person that we should exemplify and celebrate and emulate as scholars, especially in these rather polarized times. We need more Fukuyamas in the world, and we are really lucky that we have one of them. We have the only Fukuyama in the world. Actually, that's not true. We have the only Fukuyama in the world writing big books like this at Stanford, and I am really eternally grateful that we do. There's lots of other things on your bio, Frank, but let's get into it. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Fukuyama. So, Frank, I want to be brief and get out of the way.
After that wind-up, I don't know what I can say that's going to justify...
I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, and it'll be justified. Well, let me first make a confession. Some of my staff are here. They know that I block the entire day from 7 to 4 to read your book. I mean, I know some of the arguments over the courses of the years that we've been talking about them. There was this exogenous shock that happened today, and I just turned off my television after 7 hours of television watching. That's the longest I think I've ever watched television, and it feels a little bit like empty calories, but we're going to come back to that later. So correct me if I'm making assumptions about what I think the argument is along the way, and I'll read it over the weekend for sure. The first big question, yeah, I just want to I'm trying to be honest here. I planned to watch for 20 minutes, and I watched for 7 hours. But we're going to get into that because it's related to what you're writing about. But the first big thing I want to get to is a historic question. Fukuyama is one of the most famous social scientists on the planet. I also think you may be one of the most misunderstood social scientists on the planet. Because of one essay you wrote, and then nobody read the book. And I've heard you say that yourself, so that's why I feel comfortable saying that here. But help us understand that essay, the 2 volumes that came in between, and this book, because I do think there's an intellectual history here that I think people would want to hear, and help in a kind of, you know, not without summarizing the whole argument, but help understand how that your original end of history argument leads to this book.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to do that, Mike. And by the way, thanks very much for, agreeing to help me launch this. So the end of history was written in the winter of 1988-89, prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. For those of you that know this German continental historical Hegelian Marxist tradition, history means the progressive evolution of societies over long periods of time. Today we use the words modernization or development to describe that. And the end of history was something, it's not my phrase, it was really first posited by Hegel, that this process of evolution had culminated in basically a liberal society. And Karl Marx comes along and says, no, that's not right. The end of history, the true end of history will be a communist utopia. So all I did in 1988-89, when Gorbachev, our friend Gorbachev, was in power in the Soviet Union, was to say, doesn't look like that's going to happen. Doesn't look like they're ever going to get to communism. And the stopping point, the actual end of history is going to be something like a liberal democracy connected to a market economy. And I still believe that that's basically right. I mean, I think that that's the kind of form, that's the most satisfying regime, at the end of this historical process. Now, the part that people didn't get is reading the last third of my book, The End of History and the Last Man, the part on the last man. The last man is a phrase of Friedrich Nietzsche, and the last man is a person who appears at the end of history. He describes him as a man without a chest, meaning no pride. No aspiration for dignity, for justice, for any of the great things that motivated people in the past, because you're living in a peaceful democracy, prosperous, secure, and so forth. And that whole section was actually talking about future threats to democracy, because you have this thing that Plato called thumos, which is this spiritedness. It's the desire to be recognized. Most people want to be recognized as equals, but some people want to be recognized as superior. Now, turns out, I actually mentioned Donald Trump back in 1992.
Yes, you mentioned that in your book. Yeah, that's kind of amazing.
I had forgotten.
I don't think many social scientists were focused on him back then.
Yes. But I had forgotten that I had done that, but actually, it turns out that the context for that was, a democracy has to deal with really super ambitious people that will upset the democratic order. The founding fathers' solution to this was a system of checks and balances to keep that leader contained. And I was making the argument a capitalist economy also does that because it absorbs the energy of these super ambitious people. And I gave Donald Trump as an example of this.
Right.
And,
it was good that he went into the market.
Good that he went, he was harmless there. So little did I know, 25 years later, that wouldn't, well, actually he went bankrupt then and became an entertainer, but it turns out that wasn't enough. And so here we are today, this situation where he's leading this populist movement that is part of a much broader populist movement, which I think is really now the single biggest threat to global democracy that's out there right now.
Right. Well, let's get to that in a second, but let's define a few terms, because these are all very controversial terms. And let's start with identity, just so we kind of level set on that. But let's also, while we're at definitions, hear your definition of populist nationalist or nationalist populism, just so we don't have to agree on those terms. I just want people to understand the argument that you're trying to make before we get into it, just so we have your concept of those.
Yeah. Well, so, there's one sense of identity where, your driver's license has your identity on it. That's not the sense I'm using it in. I think that mine has three components. So the first is it's based on this thumos, this spiritedness. It's a universal part of the human psyche. It's a part that economists don't get at all. They understand that you've got, desires, or what they call preferences, and they understand that you've got reason, which they call, rational utility maximization. But this part of the soul, or the part of the psyche that wants other people's respect, is really not part of their model of human behavior, but I think it's really important. And it comes in these two forms. You want either equal respect, and you get very angry if other people are treated better than you, given more status, or if you are ignored or become invisible. And it takes the form of wanting to be better than other people. So, so that's the psychological basis. But there's a specific modern form of it that I think begins in European thought about 400 years ago, this idea that I have a self that's buried deep inside me. That is the authentic self, and all of the social conventions surrounding me are false because they do not dignify and recognize that inner self. And therefore, the authentic self is given a moral value that is superior to all of the social rules and laws and institutions of the surrounding society. And so that's that was Martin Luther's model, really, that it's really the inner believer that matters, and the Catholic Church that sets the rules is wrong. But it gets a secularized form, under Rousseau and other thinkers in the 19th century, and it leads really to this revolutionary outlook that says, actually recognition of the true inner self is what's important. The third element is dignity. Because the concept of dignity has shifted over the years. For Plato, it was the dignity of a warrior, somebody that risks his life. That's the only class of people that deserve respect. But I think really under the influence of Christianity that then gets secularized as time goes on, it becomes a universal thing, I think most commonly having to do with people's agency, the fact that we are moral beings that are able to make choices, make correct choices. If you say, well, on what grounds could you possibly say people are equal? I think it has to be something like that, that we differ in height and size and looks and race and, intelligence and all sorts of things. But in respect to our moral being, we all have the ability to make, choices. And I believe that becomes then the basis for modern equality. And so that's the modern, it's the combination of those three things that is the modern understanding of identity. And identity politics is driven by people who feel that they are not recognized, that they have this inner self that has worth, but the rest of the society does not recognize it. And that's the demand that, is driving our politics.
Well, and let's dig into that a little bit more. These are big, hard things to figure out, but help me understand the rest of society. That other rest of society is the same nationality or the same country, or it by definition it's an other?
Well, so nationalism is probably the first big manifestation of identity politics, right? So if you're a German in the 19th century, Germans are scattered all over Central and Eastern Europe. You don't have a single state in which all the Germans live. And so what you want is recognition. You want to bring the boundaries of Germany around, that cultural group of people that are German speakers or ethnically German. And so that's the kind of recognition, or if you're Serbia and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that's one form of it.
But not the only form,
Not the only form, because I think politicized religion has an identity component. So, Osama bin Laden, when he was 13 years old, was watching on TV, people being killed in Gaza. He he comes running into his parents' bedroom crying, saying Muslims are being disrespected and oppressed all over the world. And this is, I think in his mind begins this idea of a Muslim ummah that, is going to restore dignity to Muslims. And I think a lot of the fighters that, dropped everything to go pick up an AK-47 in Syria, a lot of them were driven by these identity confusions, that they don't want their parents' traditional form of Islam. They're not really accepted by especially the European ones, are not accepted by the societies in which they're living. And what, radical Islam does, the Islamic State, is it recognizes them and says, you're a member of this, gigantic community, and we are being oppressed, and you have agency, and you can fight back.
So that gets me, and I apologize for skipping around. I promise I'm going to come to the floor very soon, so get ready, okay? But help me understand, obviously everybody has multiple identities, right? Mm-hmm. I can think of 5 or 6 that I have and groupings, and how do we know, and under what conditions do some trump those others? I didn't mean to say Trump, but I kind of did, which is, this moment that we're in now, is there something about the particular moment in history and globally that you see this phenomena? You talk about Erdogan, Trump, Xi, Putin, Orban. Are there something that's universal about this one kind of identity being more important than the others? And I'm going to ask the methodological question about the economists in a minute, but is there unique identities in these different places that are not related to each other? And how are those 5 people, they're all called populist nationalists, not necessarily by you, but in the press they are. Should we think of them as one representative, whether the cause or the effect, but an expression of identity politics in the 21st century, or are they unrelated?
That's a lot of complicated questions to disentangle, but let me try. So I think that the immediate trigger for what's going on that's triggering this populist nationalism is in fact economic. So, as we now understand really well, globalization has made everybody rich in the aggregate, but not every individual in every country, and in particular, working classes in developed countries have been losing ground to rising middle classes in China and Bangladesh and Vietnam and so forth. But I think that people interpret that loss of a job or loss of income or loss of social status as an identity loss as well, accompanied or driven in many respects by the fact that globalization has led to these huge cultural changes in which virtually every developed country has been filling up with immigrants. And so it's not just a loss of your job, it's also, you thought that you used to define the national identity of your country, and then all of a sudden you're seeing people of different religions and races, that don't correspond to your view of what that was. The populism, we've had, at CDDRL a number of conferences on this. I think that, one of the core definitions that we agree on is that populists want to establish a direct relationship with the people that they represent. They get elected in a legitimate election, but they say, I basically am you. I'm the people. And
they want to
and that makes them automatically makes them automatically anti-institutional because they embody, the people's will. And if you've got a court or the media or an opposition party that's standing in the way of your agenda, that's not legitimate because you're blocking the people's will. And that, that applies to Orban in Hungary and to, law and justice in Poland. And I'm afraid to say it applies to our president, who, when he accepted the Republican nomination, said, I alone understand your problems and I alone can fix them. And he has been, attacking American institutions, from the moment he became president. And I think that's the, that's the threat that we face. It's not to democracy, it's really to the liberal part of liberal democracy.
And so that's why, just to underscore, because some people say, well, what's wrong with being populist? Like, that sounds like it's being democratic. And you're saying it's the attack on the institutions that makes it dangerous, right?
And by the way, I mean, part of that democratic responsiveness is actually legitimate, because I think that one thing we've realized in the last few years is that there is a really major unrecognized and underserved part of our electorate and part of the electorates in most, developed countries.
Right.
That hasn't been well represented by the elites, where their problems and their struggles have really not reached the consciousness of, the people that make movies and, write about things and so forth.
Well, let's turn now to America, because you brought up Trump. Identity politics in the U.S. are driven by social justice claims, right? So this is back to the theme of what's so bad about identity politics, right? Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement. What's wrong with these efforts of righting social injustices based on identity?
So simple answer is nothing.
Okay, good. Okay.
So look, given the 7 hours of TV you watched today, like the Me Too movement is a perfect case of this. So what's really at stake there? I would argue it's actually much more about recognition than it is about material issues, right? That women do not, they have a dignity as human beings. They don't want to be treated as sex objects. And then when a man does that to them, they get very angry and afraid, and, men use their power to, behave in that manner. And as I was saying, the modern model of identity is that inner dignity is what is given value, and it's the surrounding society that needs to change. And we're in the middle of one of these cultural revolutions right now, where, men are waking up to the fact that, no, they actually can't, continue to behave in that fashion. And it's actually the norms of the surrounding society that need to adjust to the inner dignity of, that particular group. And so as far as I'm concerned, that's perfectly just, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think in
a normative way, but then in an analytic way, it has implications.
I would say it's actually in a practical way, the way this plays out. The problem is, so people are marginalized in groups. That is true, and so you fight back as a group. But in a liberal society, we actually believe that it's individuals who have rights, that
not
groups really don't have rights. And I think that a lot of identity politics leads to a kind of group-oriented thinking where if you are born into a certain category defined by race, ethnicity, gender, religion, then you have to think a certain way, and it also leads to a kind of polarization where, the marginalized group are the good guys, and then the surrounding society are necessarily the bad people. And I think that actually doesn't correspond to, to the reality. I mean, these things overlap very strongly, but, and again, in a liberal society, we are supposed to think and act as individuals, and not simply because we were born into a particular group identity. So I think that's one of the issues.
Did you see that at play today in the hearings when you watched it?
Yeah, I would say that unfortunately is the way people have lined up. And I think one of the really poisonous things now in our politics is, so I think that the history of this is that you have these big social movements, these big important social movements regarding African Americans, women, the LGBT community, the disabled, all of which formed identity groups, all of which were pushing absolutely legitimate social justice claims, and that has, it had this effect both here and in Europe of pushing away older groups that thought that they were actually the core of the society, not.
What do you mean? Define older groups. You don't mean generation.
I mean, white people.
Okay, all right.
I mean, that's what it amounts to. I mean, that's what's been going on in American politics.
Right.
That, the Democratic Party, for example, used to be, the largest voting group were working class whites.
Right.
Right. That was part of the FDR.
Organized
coalition.
Institutionally, by the way.
In labor unions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And they were an important part of the coalition, but they've been drifting off to the Republican Party for the last 30 years. That's really what handed Trump the victory, in 2016. Same thing is going on in Europe, where a lot of white working class voters that used to vote for the Communist Party are now voting for the National Front because of the focus on marginalized identities on the part of the left, so that's not to blame the left for this, but today you get white nationalists that have adopted the identity language of the left, saying, oh, you know, we are marginalized also. People are ignoring us. The elites, you know, are basically conspiring to keep us down. We're not recognized. And, you know, to some extent, that actually reflects the reality where a lot of those people, you know, have not been adequately recognized.
So would the counterfactual have been had the, just take the Democratic Party that I know better than the other ones, but it'd be interesting to talk about Europe as well. Would the counterfactual be, had there been less identity politics on the left, that would have avoided these identity politics on the right, or was it? Are there these bigger things of immigration and globalization,
so
optimization,
I think that
drivers?
You know, I think there wasn't a way to have avoided it.
Okay.
I don't think you can replay history that way, but I do think that there's a really important choice between in front of all kind of progressive parties right now. So you start with the United States. The Democratic Party faces this big choice not so much in the November election, but they're really going to face this in 2020 when you have to unite behind a single candidate. You know, do you want to double down on the existing identity groups? And that's where all your activists live. And so as an electoral strategy, it's a very, you know, appealing one. Or do you want to try to win back some of those, you know, white working class voters, not just working class, but, you know, white voters that defected from your party over the last 30 years, and, you know, by making an appeal that is resonant, you know, with them as well. That's really the big choice. And you know, as far as I'm concerned, I think the latter strategy is really mandatory, because essentially what we're moving towards is a situation in which the Republican Party is increasingly becoming the white people's party, and the Democratic Party is becoming, you know, the party of all of the identity groups and the, you know, minority groups. And that's not a good way to organize American politics. I really want to get back to the I want to go back to the 20th century, you know, when we're fighting over taxes and, you know, social programs and, you know, and this sort of thing.
More economic issues.
Yeah, more economic issues, because if you're fighting over identities that are fixed, you're kind of stuck in a zero-sum competition.
But just to be clear, it's identity politics in both parties, right?
Yes.
I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No,
but when
and
you
I
say
think
the white people, that's also an identity that has crowded out these other things that we used to think were Republican.
No, I mean,
policies.
this is
right.
what you know, this is really what motivated me to
write the
book,
yeah.
is the rise of identitarianism on the right,
Right.
which I think is you know, it's a very bad form of polarization.
Right. Well, let's dig into a couple of the other. You already mentioned immigration, but let's talk a little bit more about causality now. And but actually, before we do it, can I have one methodological footnote? Is that okay? Okay. I believe in democracy. That's what I'm asking. I'm very struck by what you write about. I want to get a little bit more out of you in one of the early chapters about the reason why social science has been so bad at capturing what you're talking about, and you know what you write in this book. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to hear your words about the rational actor model, the utility model. Is it that economists have just taken over everything we do in the social sciences, and that's why we miss these things? Or, because it could be related, is it that those the Greek words that you use, thymos, am I saying it right? And
Themos. Yeah.
Themos. Is it also the case that those are just really hard things to measure, or is that an excuse? Because you know that I'm very like, why did so many people miss this? You know, the election. I mean, and what does it say about the way we study these things?
Yeah. No, I think you can measure it. I mean, it's just expressed in you know, different ways. So, for example, if you look at voting data from 2016, you know, the median income of Trump voters was actually higher than the national median.
Right.
Which means that, you know, a large number of people that voted for him were not these working class, you know, people living in deindustrialized, you know, depressed communities, but were pretty well-to-do. So they were not being driven by any kind of immediate, you know, economic opposition to globalization. On the other hand, you can measure things like immigration, which I think was the single biggest factor, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, that has motivated people to to vote for a populist party. So yeah, I think that there are proxies for these cultural issues. And I think the misunderstanding, you can see this in the Brexit analysis in Britain, where the Remain side kept saying, Brexit is going to be economically terrible for Britain. We're going to lose jobs,
Right.
the City of London's going to shut down, so all of which is true. But a lot of the Brexit voters said, well, we don't care. If we suffer economically, that's a price we're willing to pay as long as we can get immigration under control and stop so many foreigners from coming into the United Kingdom. And I think it was that kind of blindness where you think that people are really driven primarily by economic self-interest that, made a lot of people fail to see the real motives behind, some of that voting
Right.
behavior.
Right. Well, let's dig in a little bit on immigration, because in two different ways. One, is there a direct correlation between percentage of immigrants over the last 10 years and the rise of populism, or is it more complicated than that?
No, there's
obviously in Europe it's more complicated than that,
Yeah.
but even in North America, I'm looking at Professor Stoner here. I don't know what the percentage of immigrants in Canada are, but it's high, and yet we don't have a Trump in Canada yet. So help us understand how to frame the way we treat that variable.
So no, there's no correlation at all. So
Okay.
the two biggest populist parties are in Hungary and Poland, where there's hardly any immigration at all.
Right.
And in the United States, states with more immigrants tend to be more favorable towards immigration than states that have,
Right.
relatively low numbers. So I think the issue is not actual contact with immigrants. It really is more an intellectual thing that you see, if you are living in a place that doesn't have a lot of immigrants, you imagine to yourself, it'll be horrible if we're overrun by them and this sort of thing. So you're projecting, these kinds of cultural fears into the future.
Okay.
But I think this is really critical because there's a lot of reasons for opposing immigration, some of which are completely illegitimate and some of which are legitimate to a degree. Some of it is based on racism and xenophobia, dead stop. And so we just don't like foreigners and we don't want them in our country and so forth. But, there's another reason, which is we don't like the fact that it is, illegal, that people crossing the border are violating the law, and we believe in rule of law. Or at least we want to have some idea that we're in control of this process. And then the final one that I'm the most sympathetic is that immigration is a really good and healthy thing. We want diversity, but ultimately you also want some degree of assimilation, because if newcomers don't accept the fundamental values of your society, then you're going to end up living in these parallel communities, and you won't really have, a kind of national identity built around democratic values.
Right.
And that, I think, is a perfectly legitimate reason to, for example, the biggest case of this was in 2015 with Angela Merkel throwing open the doors to refugees in Germany. It was a tremendously praiseworthy, morally praiseworthy step. But if you ask the practical question, can Germany actually really integrate that many people that are that culturally different? I think, there's a serious question there, because Germany really does not have that great a record in that kind of cultural integration. So I think you need to disaggregate these motives, and you have to oppose the ones that are simply based on prejudice. But then you have to, figure out ways of dealing with some of the other, fears. I think in this country there's just a blindingly obvious solution that's been on the table, for a very long time, that because we're so polarized, we just haven't been able to take up. And that's essentially like a super DACA that, you have to really put in place future enforcement of existing immigration laws in a really serious way. But you also have to give like the 11, 12 million undocumented immigrants a path to citizenship, not just the children, but the parents as well. That's the basis of the 1986, Immigration Reform and Control Act. It was the basis of, the attempted immigration reform under George W. Bush. And we can't get to it because we're too damn polarized. On either side, there's a group of Republicans that absolutely will not contemplate what they call amnesty. And I'm afraid to say on the left, there's also, a group of people that really do not want serious enforcement measures. And between the two of them, I think they've made that kind of reform impossible.
Right. Things you used to write about earlier about
Yeah.
vetoes. And by the way, just listening to the hearings today, as I was riding my bike over here furiously because I was late, the biggest thing on my mind was polarization and but we're going to come to solutions in a minute. You've already mentioned one of them. In fact, we're going to end with two big questions, but one small one before we get there about Donald Trump himself. So he obviously figured out some of these things. I myself am surprised that he, of all people, would have figured this out. That came out wrong. I want to get to the question of causa. Is he the symptom or is he the cause? And number one, just him personally. And then this other thing, which I know we've discussed in some of these other forums, but I want to do it for the benefit of the launch of your book, about to the degree of the pivotal moment with the 2016 election, right? Because remember, a guy named Barack Obama won 2 elections before then. He won. I used to work for him, as I know some of you know, and I gave a copy of my book to him a few months ago. He's very proud of the fact that he won a lot of white working class people, or former working class people. We need to keep adding that. Their identity is working class, to Frank's point, but a lot of them aren't doing those kind of jobs that they used to. But he won them, downstate, Illinois, Pennsylvania. I'm from Montana. He got 47% of the vote in Montana in 2008. And not playing identity politics, right? So the question is this just about your own theory of Trump? Did he have smart people around him, or was this bound to happen and he just is the right person in the right party at the right time? And then 2, is this really an inflection point, and maybe Obama was just kind of the latent piece of it, right? He was also, after all, a kind of outsider. People forget this, but he kind of ran as a, dare I say, populist? I don't know if I'd use that word, but maybe. I mean, it was definitely a change agent, and so we're just seeing something that's been happening for decades, and now it's become more crystallized with Trump.
Well, it's a little bit of both. I mean, Trump is both cause and effect. So the polarization has been going on really since the late 1980s, and it's gotten more acute with every passing presidential cycle. And I think that Trump has, he recognized that. He also recognized the importance of this ethics of authenticity that's at the basis of identity politics. That's why I think that the tweeting is actually really important for him, because
and effective for his strategy, right?
There has never been an American president where people thought you could actually find out what he's really thinking, right?
Right.
George W.
In fact,
Bush,
we should be
Obama,
checking his tweets right now about the
No, but
hearings.
I mean, previous presidents tweeted, but they had a staff that was actually writing the tweets. It wasn't what they thought of as they're eating their their oatmeal in the morning. And Trump, everybody says,
he probably doesn't eat much oatmeal, right? It's just
whatever.
bacon and eggs.
Whatever he eats.
Identity politics. So.
But so he figured that actually being deliberately anti-political correctness and being authentic, being perceived as authentic in that way, was really something very popular that resonated with a lot of people, because so much of our politics has actually become extremely inauthentic, where politicians have to say all these stupid things, catering to particular interest groups, oftentimes defined by identity, and people were just kind of sick of that. But I think the fact that you pointed out that a lot of people that voted for Trump in 2016 had voted twice for Obama does suggest to me that really a lot of that can't possibly just be racism.
Right.
That there are a lot of these other issues, and part of this feeling that you are abandoned and ignored and not respected by the elites, I think was part of what made people vote for both Obama and for Trump.
Right. So just to warn you, I have 2 short questions left, and then we'll go to the floor. One is, I want you to tell us how scared you are about how far this can go. And in particular, when you were talking about the erosion of institutions, right? It actually reminded me of a much older literature remember Guillermo O'Donnell and Delicate of Democracy, and does anybody remember that? Okay, so yeah, we're at Stanford. But I remember, he was always talking about it within the confines of a democracy. It was a flawed democracy, right? Anytime there's an adjective used before democracy, it usually means it's some kind of flawed thing. But it seems to me this moment, and it seems like, well, I don't want to put words in it. You tell us. Under what conditions do identity politics lead to the end of democracy? And have we started to see that in some places already? I'll let you fill in the countries. Mm-hmm. And if it has, can we distinguish between countries where that may happen and where it may not? And of course, I want you to answer the question of the American democracy. Mm-hmm. Are the institutions still strong enough that despite this, our democracy will survive? Many people don't think that. But if you answer it that way, then help us understand the difference between, I don't know, the U.S. and Hungary, for instance, or Turkey, or places where it feels like it's broken down, and help us understand why breakdown in one place and maybe not in the other. Lots of questions there again.
So there's a spectrum. So
yeah, that's why
the Middle East is the place where it's gone the furthest. So Eric and I were just in Iraq, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, all those countries. Their big problem is it's like identity politics gone crazy. None of those countries have an overarching sense of national identity. So therefore, everybody lines up with the ethnic, sectarian, regional, tribal group that they were born into, and that's what the politics is. So that sets one extreme, and that's kind of a warning where you can end up if you do not have an integrating sense of national identity. I think in Eastern Europe, Hungary and Poland are new democracies that were not consolidated enough to actually develop strong check and balance institutions. So when Viktor Orban gets elected with a pretty good majority, he basically can change the constitution, and civil society isn't strong enough to stand up to him. I think in our country so far the institutions have been holding pretty well. The courts have continued to play their function. The bureaucracy is actually one of the biggest checks on the executive right now. And I think, frankly, the election in November, in a democracy, it's the electoral check is the single most important check in our check and balance system, which is why the election is going to be extremely important. And I think if the Republicans manage to hold on to both houses, then Trump the next day is going to say, American people love what I'm doing. Mueller gets fired, Jeff Sessions gets fired right away. But on the other hand, if the Democrats do really well, a lot of Republican politicians are then going to say, well, maybe this guy is actually a liability, and they'll start rethinking this sort of blind loyalty that they've shown to him. And then Congress may start working more properly as it's supposed to do, as a check on a president, even if he's of your own party. And at this point, it looks like Democrats are probably going to do well. So if that happens, I think, we're going to go down one path that will, reflect the strength of American institutions. But we'll have to see.
Well, I think you guys are doing a panel on that right after the election at
yes.
CDDRL, so come to that as well.
We're doing one before the election and one right after it.
Excellent, and so people have to go on the record beforehand. Help me understand, though, where is Hungary right now? Is Hungary, is it gone too far? Is it no longer a democracy?
Well, the trouble is...
You said a spectrum, but I'm now pushing you. How far out have we gone? So
the trouble is that the Fidesz party and Viktor Orban have stacked the deck so that it's really, really hard for an opposition party to gain any traction. However, they are part of the European Union. They just got this big rebuke in the European Parliament last week, which I was really happy about. People were finally standing up to them. They're not going to be able to get subsidies from the EU if they keep undermining democratic institutions. And because, they still do have elections, even if there's gerrymandering and, voter suppression and all these things, at some point the Hungarian people may just say we're sick of this and toss the rascals out. I mean, that just happened in Malaysia and
Right.
you know, a lot of other surprising places. So I don't think that they're so far gone that they'll never restore those institutions, but it really, right, is a uphill struggle right now.
Well, so then the last part of your book and the last question, and then we'll open it up. And we've already started to tiptoe into it, but you know, what is to be done? Like, you've mentioned some institutional reforms.
Yeah.
Well, just go ahead.
So
Like,
I think
yeah.
we need to revive a sense of national identity, American national identity. It has to be a civic national identity, meaning it cannot be an identity that is tied to race, ethnicity, or religion. In the United States, what that means is basically the Constitution, belief in the rule of law, belief in the principle of equality as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. You know, so I took our honors students on this tour of the Lincoln Memorial for Honors College last week. We do this every year. We go to the Lincoln Memorial at night and read the Gettysburg Address in the second inaugural. And in the Gettysburg Address, you know, Lincoln, after that battle in 1863, talks about a new birth of freedom. And I think my interpretation of what he meant by that new birth of freedom was basically that principle contained in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but particularly the 14th Amendment that says all persons born or naturalized on the territory of the United States are considered American citizens. That is the first moment at which America adopted a national identity that was not tied to race, because prior to that, Native Americans and African Americans did not have a right to vote. It took women, you know, a lot of other decades, you know, to get there as well. But that was the first enunciation, you know, of this new national identity, and I think that's what the new birth of freedom in Lincoln's mind was all about. It was a civic identity. What we are as Americans is we believe in government by the people, for the people, and of the people that, you know, is based on these constitutional principles. And I think that in addition to thinking about all of your problems in a particular intersectional identity group, you need to balance that with a thought towards an integrative national identity that gives Americans something to believe in common, allows them to deliberate together and to coexist in a democratic, you know, national community. So that's, I think, first and foremost the thing that I would emphasize.
Well, but we don't have to have a civil war to bring it about, right? To not be too flippant about it. So but how does that happen? How does that begin? And talk both abstractly, but also maybe talk about it on an individual basis. Like,
well, I mean, part of it is a matter of leadership, the way that our leaders talk about our society. But part of it is also done through the education system. And so I do think that we have neglected civic education. I mean, if you look at these surveys of what high school students know, you know, can you identify a single right in the Bill of Rights, or can you identify the three branches of government? It's really appalling, you know, at how ignorant people are. And I think you also can't really understand your system if you don't know a little bit about its history and the provenance of some of the ideas that led to, you know, the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and the Constitution. And that's all stuff that really, you know, the state is responsible for. You got to educate people. They don't just pick this up, you know, kind of surfing on the internet. So that's one thing that I would, you know, begin with.
okay, that's something concrete. Let's, oh, good, we have time. I'm not sure, it looks like we have a microphone here, so I guess we're going to have people go to the microphone. Let's do that. Is that right? We can do that? Either way, Ren, you go ahead. You can stand up.
Thank you very much. I thought
and if you all could introduce yourselves and then ask a question.
Sure. My name is Ren Elheim. I'm a first-year student in international policy here. I wanted to ask, basically pick up where you left off with how you build a national identity and ask what you think about, you know, I think people who are concerned about this issue are maybe also resistant in some cases to some of the kind of fuzzier, softer, intangible symbols of national identity. You know, like we talk about standing for the, you know, the flag, the anthem, the founding fathers who have been really problematized in a lot of kind of discussions of U.S. history. Like, do we really want to hold up slaveholders as our national heroes? So what do you think that people who are concerned about the deterioration of a national identity, especially in the US, need to be more comfortable, or how could you get to, kind of some national symbols that are acceptable to all people under those sorts of circumstances?
Yeah, so
Good question.
as a practical matter, it may be difficult, partly as a result of the kind of identity politics, that we have been experiencing. I think that when you teach American history, it should be perfectly possible to talk about all of the slavery, the injustice, the prejudice, the subordination that has existed in American history, but also to talk about, the progressive side of that, about how the country managed to overcome these problems, through things like fighting a civil war and through the civil rights struggle and so forth, and still say that there's a kind of redemptive, progressive side to this, and you cannot, simply argue that that history is one of, racism and patriarchy. I just think that that's not possible. As a practical matter, if you are a national politician trying to run for president and you run on a platform that our country is basically the home of racism and patriarchy, you're not going to get elected. So just as a practical matter, that ain't a winning argument. And so actually as a practical matter, what I think is Democrats need to, win the patriotism issue back. They can't let the Republicans own this. And so in terms of those national symbols, respecting them, kind of understanding Americans' role in the world, that's very important for them to gather back.
Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you for engaging conversation so far. My name is Casper. I'm a first-year student here at FSI in the International Policy Studies program. I'm interested, we've talked a little bit already, or you have rather, about attacks on institutions, but mostly in the context of attacks on domestic democratic institutions. And I'm wondering what you think the implications are for this rise of identity politics, particularly in Western Europe and North America, are for international institutions, in particular international security institutions like NATO.
Well, I don't think that's a really hard question to answer. It's bad, right? I mean, we have a,
How bad?
really bad. Yeah, how do you like that for social science
That's
answer?
good. It's really bad. No, that sounds like we're in some intelligence community briefing.
Yeah.
It's always,
Yeah.
there's only
it's
three.
About,
Yeah.
it's this bad.
Yes.
No, well, no, so obviously, all of the European populist politicians are anti-EU, and so they're doing their best to try to undermine the EU. You have a president whose first act was to withdraw from the TPP, wants to get out of NAFTA, question the importance of NATO, doesn't really like the WTO. So there's a whole, kind of anti-international institutionalist side to this. How durable those institutions will be is an interesting question. I think that they're probably a little bit safer than you might think, simply because I think a lot of people realize that their prosperity is really pretty heavily linked to their survival, and that if you simply abandon them, you're not actually going to have a very nice world that you're living in. There's actually even further, so as we speak, Steve Bannon is running around to Hungary and Poland and to all these other places with populist parties. He was in Italy, just this past week trying to talk to their populist party. Now, the nice thing about a populist nationalist is that although they may agree in principle that they don't like elites, they all hate different elites, and they all have different national, interests that they are supporting. And there's not a natural degree of cooperation between all of them, when you get right down to it. And so it turns out that the populists in Poland really don't like Putin's brand of populism because Poles don't like Russians, and so forth. So I think there is a kind of natural limit. We're going to have actually a workshop on what's called the Nationalist International, and the degree to which you're actually getting a kind of anti-institutional coalition building in the world. So we'll have to wait, the results of that workshop to really come to any conclusions, but I do think there probably is a kind of natural limit to how far some of that stuff can go. But again, the United States is so important in all of this, and this is why actually what I think happens here domestically really, really matters for the rest of the world, because it was American power and American influence that really held these institutions together. And once that goes, it's really hard to see what other power is going to come and fill that vacuum. And so, so I guess my answer is, how bad is it? It's kind of conditional on what happens here.
Can I ask a footnote to that just before your question? Because I meant to ask it about political parties. I thought what you said about American institutions being rather resilient, I agree with, by the way. The one area where it feels they're not performing well are political parties in terms of the creation of these identities and cross-cleavage issues as opposed to identity politics. Is that also, and in Europe, I think, others who are more expert than me in the room can speak to this, but is that also a paradoxical blessing in disguise, that populists don't have strong parties as well? Or is that that's looking too much for silver linings? I mean, you don't have, when you think of other populist movements, you have this strong party identity,
no,
right?
I do not think that you can make a generalization that parties as a whole are declining. What are really declining are parties of the left, both, especially in Europe. So if you look at, like, the French Socialist Party really has disappeared as a party. The German Social Democratic Party is much, much weaker. All the Social Democrats in Scandinavia are much weaker. The mainstream party, also the center-right parties, are losing ground.
Right.
I'm not sure that you can make a generalization that parties as a whole are weakening.
Okay. All right.
So that, in our country, it's a kind of funny situation, but I think, again, we're holding another workshop on political parties in October or November, so it's something we're thinking about a lot. But in our country, it's a kind of funny situation. The parties are more homogeneous and more ideologically united than ever, but the party, in terms of the institutional party, meaning all of the governors and the party bureaucrats and the National Party leadership, I don't think has ever been weaker because of all the money that's sloshing around in the American political system.
That subverts their control, right?
Yeah, so neither party can really control who gets nominated. It's all the result of all of these big donors that are pushing, particular agendas, and the parties themselves, I think, are just completely gutted.
Okay, sorry, I apologize for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sure. My name is Min Lee. I'm a lecturer at Stanford University. I thought that your argument was very persuasive when you pointed out that the current crisis in democracy can be traced back to the loss of identity on the part of people, many of whom are in the working class, and they feel like when they lose their jobs, they're not just losing a source of income, but they're losing their sense of dignity and their sense of standing and status. So I was wondering what can be done to help the working class to stem this crisis in democracy, especially given that one of the major political parties is very much opposed to any programs that might help the working class.
Well, so this is this weird thing about American politics, that people don't necessarily vote their own economic self-interest, and this is particularly true. So one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act are actually rural whites, working class whites in the South. And they're they're the group that are going to really lose when when insurance companies can discriminate on the basis of pre-existing conditions and so forth. And yet, that group of voters has been voting for Republican politicians that have been promising to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. So go figure. And that's why I think that actually it's these identity drivers that are persuading people to vote a certain way rather than, kind of any kind of narrow understanding of self-interest. So you could say, well, the solution to working class misery is actually to expand social services and, other welfare state benefits for them. But in our politics, it just doesn't work that way, because people regard the state with a great deal of suspicion and so forth. So that's why I think actually to get those voters back, you actually have to get to some of the cultural issues that are bothering them. And that's why I think you need a different position. I mean, that's why immigration reform is actually a fairly urgent thing. So for example, I think the Democratic Party cannot build an immigration party around sanctuary cities and abolishing ICE, because that, culturally is just not going to resonate with that kind of voter. They, want to feel that the party stands in favor of rule of law and this sort of thing. Other things to win them back, I think partly it's just, recognizing that they're an important bloc that needs to be cultivated, and you need to listen to them. That's the thing about dignity. A lot of dignity is not where people are deliberately disrespecting people. A lot of indignity is invisibility, that you are simply not seen as a fellow human being by, your fellow human beings. That's what, so in Ralph Ellison's famous novel, Invisible Man, it's about an African-American man that moves from the South to Harlem. And he's saying, in the North, you don't have overt segregation like you did in the South, so people aren't actively trying to exclude you, but the form that racism takes is invisibility, that people don't see you as a human being. They don't make eye contact with you on the street, That's really what hurts. And I think that that's the way a lot of, people in that class, of voters has felt about the elites that live in places like Palo Alto, that group of people has become invisible. And so I think you somehow need to, figure out how to see them. And you can begin just by, I think, a more sympathetic understanding of their situation.
Thank you, Frank. My name is Louise Liu. I was at DSB's executive program and just back this week for the reunion. So I have a question about democracy, dictatorship, and the demand for dignity, especially in particularly on U.S.-China relations. After 2008, sort of the world has been struggling to get back on its track, but China kept rising. So to a point, certain people were asking, is democracy the only solution to things? And more importantly, right now at the moment, U.S. is sort of, at least Trump is talking about being bullied by China. It's cheap good, the tariff, IP issues. At the same time, China feels it's being bullied by U.S. Be it the WTO is not measuring rightly, or is rise, or even Martin Wolf argues that U.S. need to accept China's rise. So, what's your take on this? And if, say, you were to meet President Xi and Trump now at the same time, what would be your advice to them separately? Thank you.
So not just President Xi, but he has made a big deal of this, gaining legitimacy by talking about China's 100 years of humiliation, right? That this has been a constant trope in post-reform China, but particularly with a leader that wants to secure his legitimacy as a national, a leader of a Chinese national revival. And so he's playing off that resentment of that entire legacy, from the Opium Wars on, when China was, which had always been one of the world's great civilizations, was treated as, kind of a doormat by, the imperialist powers and so forth. And it's the Communist Party that succeeded in reversing that. And I don't see how you're ever going to get them to come off of that narrative because, A, it's partly true, or it's true in many respects, and B, it's just too, it's too obvious a kind of source of legitimacy for them to ever reject. I actually think that the trade issues should not be dealt with in these identity terms, because you're never going to solve them that way. I just think you need to, get real about, what the real agendas are. And underneath this, I don't think it's an identity fight. I think it's really just a fight over economic policy. And those fights are a lot easier to resolve because you can actually change economic policy in a way that you can't change identity. And here, there are Chinese practices that really need to be fixed. I think, we on our part haven't been keeping up in a lot of ways in terms of, some of our economic policies. But that's the level I would analyze this in, and not try to shift it into an identity frame.
Thank you.
Hi, Frank. My name is H.R., and I'm a Knight Fellow in journalism here at Stanford.
Your name is HR?
Well, my
There's
initials
another-
are H.R.
There's another one that just joined us. That's why I was asking. You should. We'll have you meet him soon.
That'll be fantastic. My question relates to democracies in the global south. I come from India, where it's a pretty diverse country, as you know, with 22 languages. But one party has consolidated the vote by appealing to one part of of identity, which is the Hindu identity. And there are other countries where I've seen this as well. For example, South Africa, identity plays out differently in Brazil and Argentina. So how do you see identity as a force in these democracies?
No,
in
I
the
mean,
global
so
south?
this is why I wrote this book. It's a global phenomenon that many politicians are trying to shift their national identities onto these fixed categories. So India, up until the rise of the BJP, would have been one of my top examples of a country that had created a liberal, open identity, given the reality of India's de facto diversity. You have no choice but to do this. So Indian national identity, Sunil Khilnani wrote this book about the idea of India. And it really is an idea. What unites Indians is a commitment to a certain set of institutions, to democracy, to a kind of liberal order that managed to accommodate all of this, cultural diversity. And you're right, you've now got a leader that wants to shift it back onto a Hindu identity, which then excludes a whole, hundreds of millions of people from that identity. And that's really a formula for a lot of conflict. It's going on in other places. I think, Abe in Japan also represents a certain, specific narrative about Japanese history that is much more nationalist than prime ministers before him. You're right, in South Africa, you got this really scary guy, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who next month could end up the president of Brazil, he is a super Donald Trump. A really much, much worse version, because he's just overtly racist, says, basically police ought to be able to go in and kill, all these black criminals in the favelas and this sort of thing. You've got a version of this going on with Duterte in the Philippines. And so I think that this is it's a global phenomenon where identity is becoming the main focus. It's being driven by, I think, opportunistic politicians who see that this is a way to gain power away from, more liberal parties that have based their appeals on, more policy-related grounds. So there's no global solution to this. I think this has to be opposed and fought, country by country, and yours is one of the, the front lines of that.
Is there one country that's doing really well in this fight? You just listed a lot of negative cases. Is there a place that inspires you at how they're managing identity?
Well, there have been color revolutions and pro-democracy revolutions. The most recent one was this amazing vote in Malaysia, where they're trying to get back control from this really corrupt. Well, so Najib, the former prime minister, was actually playing that identity card, that Malaysia had. It was an Islamic, Islam was important, but he was really playing the Islam card. He was encouraging, the more radical Islamist parties, accepting support for them. And I think that Mahathir's comeback, although, he's got a kind of questionable authoritarian past, that's a good sign. Our Ukrainian friends in the audience, Ukraine has managed to fight a revolution of dignity where, they want to actually create a country that's based on modern European principles. There are populists, running in Ukraine, but I think, that's going to be a big fight because there's a lot of Ukrainians that don't want that. So I think, there's still a desire to have a kind of more open order, expressed by a lot of people around the world.
And right, it was called the Revolution of Dignity.
Revolution of Dignity.
Right, in Ukraine. So we're running out of time. I think we should take these 3 questions, and that'll get us to the end of our formal time. But we have books, most importantly. So for those of you leaving early, you still can buy a book, even if you're leaving early. I've noticed some that did not stop and buy a book. And then we'll also have a reception afterwards where we can talk more informally with Frank. So we'll just take these last 3 in sequence, and then we'll finish.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm Laura Jackley. I'm one of the CDDRL predoctoral fellows this year.
Hi.
And I'm really, nice to meet you. I'm really interested
You're
in
from
the
Hungary,
idea
right?
of, from Hungary,
Yes.
So I have many identities here that are sad for the world right now. So the politics of resentment, I'm interested in, especially from the point of view of what is quote unquote real resentment and what is a perception of resentment that is not necessarily based in reality, right? So as you've mentioned, Hungary and Poland aren't actually taking in millions of refugees right now. There are other places where the politics of economic grievance are very, very successfully mobilized, even though they may not necessarily be occurring quite like that on the ground. So I'm really interested in this distinction between quote unquote structural resentment and perceptions of resentment. And what I'm interested in to hear a little bit more about is how political communication and information and news figure into your conception of how we can come back from this age of politics of resentment to something that's a little bit more based in quote-unquote real structural concerns.
Yeah, so I don't think that there's any rigorous way that you can distinguish between what's genuine resentment. I mean, it's a moral judgment, basically, right? I mean, you're saying, are people who feel disrespected truly being disrespected, and what is the degree of disrespect, what is the proper way to value them? These are all kind of complex, contextual, moral judgments that I don't think you've got a clear methodology for making. I think in general, it is very hard to create a politics of resentment out of whole cloth if there isn't something there. And so in Hungary, there is, I mean, if you look at the sociology of who votes for Fidesz, they're not the people in cosmopolitan Budapest for the large part. I mean, they're people that are living, in more rural areas and are really not as connected to the rest of Europe as, the more urban people are. And, some of them do feel that, they see what's going on in Germany or France and they say, well, we're really worried that we're going to fall into that same situation. Is that a legitimate fear? Probably not. But again, I just think it requires a more qualitative, moral judgment about the specific arguments that are being made, and then the response to it. That moral judgment is important because the appropriate response is to figure out what part of the resentment is actually grounded in something that people have a real reason for, being unhappy about, and then trying to do something about that, right? So that's why I'm saying, in terms of opposition to immigration, you need to disaggregate, between the pure racists and the people that are worried about other things like, ultimate assimilation, and then you can do something about the assimilation part, but you can't, do anything other than simply oppose the people that are doing it on just racist grounds. So in terms of communication and, that's a whole, that's a whole complicated set of issues because the political communication, when your society reaches a point of polarization that exists in Hungary today and unfortunately now exists in Washington, you can't communicate. That's one of the problems is that, you just watch this in the Kavanaugh here. Depending on where you stand, on the fundamental polarization, you saw two completely different, you either saw a horribly mistreated woman or you saw a really horribly mistreated, upstanding guy out there. And which of those, you saw watching the same TV show or same TV coverage is completely determined by where you stood on your priors, in terms of the basic red-blue polarization. So I'm not quite sure how communication by itself can be a sort of independent variable that fixes this problem, as opposed to more political solutions that that alter that underlying polarization. So that's not a very coherent answer, but it's the best I can do on the since you put me on the spot.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Julia Fleischer. I'm a visiting scholar at ScanCore, and I'm pretty intrigued by the idea of identity politics and its relation to potential dangers for the institutions. I would be curious, what role does bureaucracy have here? The executive branch. We talked about parties.
Yeah.
What's your take on this? Thank you.
Well, based on my previous books, I really like bureaucracies. I actually like the idea of an administrative state. I think that there was this old Weberian ideal of an impersonal bureaucracy that was serving public interests rather than, private interests. Actually, this was an idea of Hegel's as well. And we still have that to some degree in the United States. So if you go to NASA or the CDC or, even the Fed, I mean, you have a number of bureaucracies that basically do serve this public interest. The people that work in them feel that, they are public servants, in the best sense of the word. And one of the terrible things that I think is going on in American politics is we are progressively politicizing all of those institutions. And, part of it is just this overt process of putting political appointees into these bureaucratic positions. I mean, there's no question in a democracy, when you win an election, you have a right to set the overall political direction. But in a well-functioning democracy, I think that you recognize that you do need the support of these, nonpartisan, fairly impersonal people that will actually carry out the administration of, your government, whatever your government policies are. And the identity politics is basically poisoning a lot of that impartiality, so that, people are, today you're seeing this in the court. Like, the court is supposed to be one of the, just calling balls and strikes, right? That you don't call things based on your ideological priors. Unfortunately, I think that kind of court disappeared a long time ago.
Right.
And it's creeping into other, other institutions as well, to the point that, like NOAA, I mean, every time there's a hurricane and they give hurricane warnings, there are people on the right that say, no, these are liberals that have an agenda. They want to, tell us about global warming, right? So this sort of thing is happening in the country. And that's, that's very bad.
Hi, Professor Fukuyama. I'm Kai-Wen Tong, and I come from Taiwan. I took your course last year. So I have a question about the identity politics in some ethnically homogeneous society. Like, you just mentioned some cases in more multi-ethnic society, like American or European, that identity politics is driven by some ethnic conflict or some immigration issue. But I wonder if your theory can apply to those ethnically homogeneous societies such as Taiwan and South Korea. For example, Taiwan is suffering from the polarization between independence and unification. So I have two questions. First, can you theory that identity politics driven by the demand for dignity apply to this homogeneously country? And second, is there a difference in identity politics between those homogeneous countries and those multi-ethnically society? Thank you.
Yeah, so by the way, so Taiwan is not free of these ethnic identity issues, right? So people that were born on Taiwan do not, a lot of them do not feel that they're part of China, and they never agreed with the KMT, agenda of claiming to represent the whole of China. And, a lot of them are at the root of the Taiwan independence movement. And then, even within that group, there are indigenous Taiwanese that were not the Chinese that came over in the 19th century, but people that had lived on the island even before that, and they've got a separate language, and and they're asserting their separate ethnic identity. So I think that kind of ethnic division is also present in Taiwan. But I would say that you can construct identity around any damn thing you want. And, so in the Byzantine Empire, there was a fundamental cleavage between the blues and the greens that were represented by those were the colors of two racing teams in the hippodrome that corresponded to a theological cleavage between monophusites and monothelites. And these people ended up fighting a civil war with each other and wrecking Constantinople, because they were so much aligned, on both kind of theological and, basically which team they like better, which sports team they like better. So people will, create these very strong identities, and in a way we're sort of programmed to do that, to really love our people that we identify with and to hate people on the outside. So there's lots of different ways in which identity can play out, and that's why I think ultimately in politics you do need these larger, more integrating identities and not let your society sink into these, us versus them kinds of, team efforts.
Thank you.
Well, I was hoping that was going to end more optimistically, that we could go to war between Stanford and Berkeley, but you did actually. You turned it around.
Let me give you one. So you were asking for positive examples. So let me just cite the one that I cite in the book, which was, which is described in the movie Invictus.
Yes.
So after the end of apartheid, it was a highly polarized society in South Africa where the blacks played soccer and the whites played rugby. And what Invictus is about is a visionary leader, Nelson Mandela, who wanted, so South Africa was hosting the Rugby World Cup in 1996. Right. The Springboks, their national team, was an almost all-white team, and he decided that it would be important to get the black community in South Africa to root for their national rugby team. And the whole movie is about his effort to bring the African National Congress along in that agenda. And, he managed to succeed in that. It helped that the Springboks actually beat the All Blacks and actually won the tournament. But, that's an example, I think, of how leadership, the right kind of leadership, can actually, work to kind of overcome some of these identity divisions. But it has to be based on the right idea. It has to be based on somebody that's willing to take some risks.
But it is in the book, and even your negative story that's a good positive note we're going to end on, which is that these are not fixed identities. It's not predetermined, and leaders and in their ideas can matter as long as they're good leaders with good ideas.
Absolutely.
And on that, I think we're going to end. I want you to thank me in 3 different ways. The first way you're going to thank me is you're going to buy Frank's book right now. Books are really hard things to write. I can tell you from experience, there are hard things to write, and they need to be celebrated, and the best way to celebrate them is to buy them. And if you've bought Frank's other books, you'll know that this one's thin by Fukuyama standards, right? So you should buy this one. That's the first thing. That's the first way you're going to thank Professor Fukuyama. The second way, I just want to say this has been a fantastic discussion, and we'll continue to have this discussion along these different workshops that you mentioned, Frank, because we do have a core group at your center to do that. I consider this like the beginning of the academic year, so what a great way to launch that.
By the way, this is actually the first of our CDDRL weekly seminar series.
All the better, so get on the website and see what's coming, because it actually is. It's a great fall quarter. And then just as I promised, I said Frank was always interesting, provocative, and engaging with everybody and everyone. You saw a testimony to that again today, and I just am thrilled that you're here with us and continuing to be as productive as you are. So then we can now go drink. I think we can drink, right? There is some drinks, right? Okay, we're going to drink coffee. We're going to drink coffee and cookies. We're going to buy books, and then I think Frank is going to sign some as well. So join me in thanking Frank on the book. That was great. That was fantastic.